I didn't find the letter. That's the first thing I need to say. Because finding suggests searching. And I wasn't searching. I was reorganizing my life in the smallest way possible, the way people do when they're not ready for larger changes. I was clearing space. The hallway closet had always been a place of quiet resistance in our house. My mother didn't forbid anyone from touching it. She simply discouraged it with a tone that didn't invite questions. "It's just old things," she used to say. "Nothing important." But the truth is, we all know when something isn't important, and when it's simply not meant to be disturbed. That closet carried the second kind of weight. I had put it off for years, walking past it the way you walk past a memory you're not sure you're ready to reinterpret. That afternoon, though, I needed space more than I needed certainty. And sometimes, that's all it takes. I moved coats I didn't recognize anymore. Scarves that still held her scent faintly. The quiet evidence of a life that had been lived mostly inward. Then I felt it. Not the box itself. The hesitation. The brief pause in my body that arrived before my thoughts could assemble. As if something in me had already stepped forward to say, "This matters." I ignored that instinct. We're very good at doing that. My mother was not a woman of secrets. At least, not in the way people imagine secrets. She didn't whisper. She didn't hide phone calls. She didn't disappear into other lives. Her secrecy was quieter. It lived in what she chose not to explain. She believed deeply in endurance. In getting through things without naming them too loudly. In carrying discomfort privately so others wouldn't have to. When I was a child, I thought that was strength. As an adult, I understand it differently. She had grown up in a time where asking for more felt dangerous. Where wanting clarity could cost you stability. Where women learned early that silence was often safer than truth. She loved me fiercely, but carefully. She protected me not by telling me everything, but by filtering the world until it felt manageable. There were questions I learned to soften before asking. Not because she forbade them, but because she answered them with pauses. With sentences that bent away from the truth just before they reached it. And I learned, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that some things were better left untouched. Not forbidden. Just fragile. Before she was my mother, she was a young woman making decisions in a world that didn't leave much room for revision. The letter would later speak of this time. But even before I read it, I sensed its presence, the version of her I had never known. The woman she was before she learned how to survive quietly. Before she learned which truths were dangerous to hold openly. There are always parts of our parents that don't survive parenthood. Not because they disappear, but because they become impractical. My mother had learned early that safety was not something you stumbled into. It was something you protected. She didn't chase happiness. She chose predictability. She chose outcomes she could manage. And once that choice was made, it shaped everything that followed. Even me. The box was old cardboard, worn at the edges. It had been opened before, carefully, and then sealed again with intention. Inside it were ordinary things. Photographs curled slightly at the corners. Receipts folded with unnecessary precision. A scarf I remembered her wearing when I was small, tied the same way every winter. Objects don't lie. They simply wait. And at the bottom of the box, there was the envelope. Yellowed with time. Edges softened by years of restraint. No name on the front. No instructions. Just presence. I didn't touch it at first. Because something about it didn't feel forgotten. It felt placed. Hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was deliberate. That's when the thought arrived, uninvited. I don't think this was meant for me. And yet, there it was. In my hands. That's the paradox of inherited silence. It's meant to protect you. Until it reaches you anyway. I sat on the floor with the envelope resting on my lap. I remember feeling something that surprised me. Guilt. Not because I had done anything wrong. But because knowing felt like crossing a line I hadn't been invited to cross. I thought about how many times my mother must have stood near that closet. How many moments she had to destroy what was inside, and didn't. That mattered. She hadn't erased the truth. She had postponed it. And suddenly I understood something painful and tender at the same time. This letter wasn't hidden because it was dangerous. It was hidden because it was heavy. And she had chosen to carry it alone. The paper was thin. Folded more times than necessary, like someone had needed extra layers between the words and the world. The handwriting stopped me. It was hers. But older. Less controlled. She didn't start with my name. She started with a reason. I'm writing this because one day you might wonder why I made the choices I did. I stopped reading. Because suddenly, the past wasn't the past anymore. This wasn't a confession meant to be understood in context. It was a map. And I was standing in the middle of it. As I read on, my childhood rearranged itself quietly. Moments that had always felt neutral began to carry weight. Her insistence on stability. Her fear of sudden change. Her belief that peace was something you preserved, not something you questioned. Things I had once thought were personality revealed themselves as strategy. She wasn't cautious because that was who she was. She was cautious because that was how she survived. Then I reached the sentence that changed the texture of everything. There are truths that don't belong to the people who come from them. I read it once. Then again. Then I set the letter down. Because something in me understood what that meant. And didn't want to admit it yet. This wasn't a story of betrayal. There was no scandal hiding between the lines. No dramatic reveal that justified the silence. What she described was far more difficult to carry. She wrote about choosing silence as an act of love. About absorbing the weight of a past decision so it wouldn't shape the life of her child. She hid this letter not because she was afraid of judgment. She hid it because she wanted me to grow up unburdened. And that realization cracked something open inside me. Because I understood. She hadn't lied to me. She had protected me. But protection has consequences. And as I kept reading, I saw them clearly. Her silence had shaped my instincts. Her caution had taught me fear. Her endurance had taught me to stay. I had learned to accept half answers. To tolerate emotional distance. To confuse stability with safety. Not because I was weak. But because it was familiar. This is the moment the ground shifted. Not dramatically. Quietly. Because I realized something that no one prepares you for. What protects you in childhood can limit you in adulthood. And that realization didn't end with my mother. It ended with me. After I finished reading the letter, I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had expected grief, or anger, or relief. Instead, what I felt was recognition. The quiet, unsettling kind. Because suddenly, moments from my adult life began to line up in ways I had never allowed myself to see before. The relationships I had chosen. The conflicts I had avoided. The truths I had softened so they wouldn't demand too much of me. I had always told myself I was patient, understanding, mature. But reading my mother's words, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't just being kind. I was being careful. In the same way she had been careful. I had learned to love without asking too many questions. To stay without pressing for clarity. To tolerate distance as long as nothing was visibly broken. Because that was the model I had been given. Not consciously, but completely. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that I was overinterpreting. That I was projecting meaning backward. That one letter couldn't explain an entire life. We do this instinctively. When the truth feels too close, we look for ways to make it smaller. I told myself my mother's story was hers. That I was different. More aware. More capable of choosing freely. And for a few hours, that explanation almost worked. Almost. But denial doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as comfort. And comfort, I was learning, had always been my weakness. Later that night, something shifted again. I was lying in bed, replaying conversations from years ago. Moments I had dismissed as insignificant. Questions I had never followed up on. Answers I had accepted too quickly. And suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I had stayed in situations long after curiosity had turned into quiet unease. Not because I didn't notice, but because noticing would have required action. And action would have disrupted the sense of safety I had learned to protect at all costs. That was the second collapse. Not dramatic, but devastating in its clarity. Because it meant I wasn't just shaped by my mother's silence. I was continuing it. This is the part that scared me the most. Not what had already happened, but what would happen if nothing changed. I imagined myself years from now. Still choosing stability over truth. Still absorbing discomfort quietly. Still calling endurance love. I imagined becoming my mother, not in her strength, but in her sacrifice. Carrying truths alone. Protecting others at my own expense. Passing down silence disguised as care. And for the first time, I felt something sharper than sadness. I felt urgency. Because inheritance is not just about what we receive. It's about what we continue. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels exposed, this story isn't only about my mother. And it isn't only about me. It's about the quiet agreements we make with ourselves. The moments we choose comfort over clarity. The times we tell ourselves it's fine because nothing is bad enough to leave. It's about the cost of living safely and the price we pay for avoiding truth. And if this feels personal, it's because it is. Not accusatory, but honest. In the weeks that followed, the change wasn't loud. But it was constant. I noticed how often my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening when something wasn't right. A hesitation when I was about to agree too quickly. For the first time, I didn't ignore those signals. I paused. I asked follow-up questions. I allowed conversations to become uncomfortable. Not because I wanted conflict, but because I no longer wanted to disappear. Truth, I was learning, doesn't arrive to destroy relationships. It arrives to clarify which ones can survive honesty. The letter didn't give me answers about my mother. It gave me permission. Permission to choose differently. Permission to stop protecting everyone else at my own expense. Permission to break the cycle quietly, without blame, without drama. My mother had written that letter not to explain herself, but to leave a doorway. One she hoped I might walk through if I was ever ready. I placed the letter back in the box. Not to hide it again, but to honor what it had carried for 40 years. My mother didn't hide that letter because she was ashamed. She hid it because she loved me enough to carry the weight alone. And now that I had seen it, the weight was no longer hers. It was choice. Some truths are hidden not because they are dangerous, but because someone loved you enough to hold them until you were strong enough to decide what to do with them. And sometimes, the most powerful inheritance isn't the truth itself. It's the moment you finally realize you are allowed to choose differently.